Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story that goes way beyond your typical daily economic headlines. We're exploring the hidden reality of the 99% and how working families are actually managing to survive in today's economy. And honestly, here's the hard truth. They aren't surviving through savings. They're surviving through borrowing. The financial safety net we all once relied on, it's fundamentally shifted, and we absolutely need to understand what's taken its place.
There's this fundamental question we really have to ask ourselves. Has debt become the new safety net for working people? And more importantly, what on earth happens when that safety net inevitably fails? Keeping that single idea in the back of your mind completely changes how you look at the entire economic landscape.
Okay, let's dive into this massive number. In the fourth quarter of 2025, total household debt reached a staggering $18.8 trillion. But we need to look past all those zeros. This isn't a story about luxury purchases or reckless shopping sprees. No, this historic figure represents working families desperately financing their daily survival, literally just trying to bridge that ever-widening gap between the rising cost of living and the reality of their paychecks.
We all face unavoidable financial shocks, right? The car breaks down, a kid gets sick, the landlord hikes up the rent. But notice what the most common household response is today. These everyday emergencies are no longer being met with a healthy little emergency savings fund. They're being met with plastic. Debt has basically become this fragile, high-interest bridge over an economic gap that working families simply cannot cross any other way.
Section 1. Financing daily survival. How credit cards fill the gap between income and expenses. When wages just don't cover the basics, credit cards are invariably the very first tool the 99% reach for. And here's exactly why that is so incredibly dangerous. In the first quarter of 2026, the average annual percentage rate, the yearly interest charged on borrowed money, hit 21.52%. If you're forced to use credit just to buy your weekly groceries, that short-term survival tactic is immediately charged at a rate that mathematically ensures long-term financial captivity.
We really need to understand that these aren't budgeting failures. These are systemic traps. Sky-high interest rates make balances absolutely explode. While those minimum payments, they keep families on the hook for years. And then late fees relentlessly punish working-class people who are literally just trying to stretch their money into the next payday. Because these cards are being used for basic survival, food, gas, bills, utilization rates skyrocket. That tanks credit scores and makes any future financial move way more expensive.
Section 2. Unavoidable financial shocks. When debt turns daily life into a full-blown crisis.
So, there are three major pillars of household debt that families simply cannot opt out of. First up, student loans, which have aggressively re-entered the crisis chat. We usually talk about student loans as an education issue, but honestly, it's way more than that. It's a massive barrier. For the 99%, carrying student debt severely impacts their debt-to-income ratio. It blocks them from qualifying for a mortgage, stops them from getting capital to start a business, and essentially puts wealth building on permanent hold.
And we are seeing this pressure right now. The total delinquency rate for student loans recently shot up to 10.3%. Just to put that into perspective, that's roughly 2.6 million borrowers who are already more than 4 months behind. When millions of people have their cash flow squeezed this tightly by an expense they can't avoid, the entire household budget just begins to buckle. Then we have the second pillar, medical debt. This turns completely unavoidable health emergencies into sudden financial collapse. And it's vital to remember that this happens even to folks who have health insurance. High deductibles, surprise out-of-network bills, and the sheer loss of work hours mean that simply getting sick becomes a catastrophic economic event. Families aren't just fighting to get healthy again. They're suddenly fighting to protect their credit, their housing, and their stability from collapsing entirely.
And the third unavoidable pillar is transportation. Auto loans and transport costs just add immense pressure. For the working class, a car is not a luxury, it's literally the prerequisite for employment. You need a car to get to work, to drop the kids at childcare, but when high loan rates and repair costs force families to fall behind, they face repossession. In a lot of areas, losing your car directly translates to losing your job. It creates this massive, hidden employment crisis.
And this brilliantly illustrates our next point. Section 3. When the dominoes fall. The breaking point of household debt and collections.
So what exactly happens at the breaking point when families can absolutely no longer juggle those minimum payments? Well, they enter the pipeline of financial collapse. It's this tragic, cascading domino effect. It almost always starts with an unavoidable shock, a medical emergency, a sudden car repair, that forces the family into high-interest credit debt just to survive. When the compounding interest becomes totally impossible to pay, the debt goes to collections.
And finally, when all avenues are exhausted, it forces a bankruptcy filing. It's a systematic pipeline, and one single missed paycheck can push a household straight down it.
Take a look at this figure from 2025, 471,142. That is the exact number of debt collection complaints received by the FTC. This number is incredibly telling. Why? Because it represents the exact moment when private, hidden financial stress erupts into very public, very aggressive legal pressure on the 99%.
The harsh reality of collections is way more than just a few annoying phone calls during dinner. It spirals quickly into lawsuits, wage garnishment, and bank levies. Think about the real-world impact of that. At the exact moment a family is struggling the absolute most, their take-home pay is legally reduced and their available bank funds are frozen. The collection process actively prevents these households from ever getting back on their feet.
Which naturally leads us to this grim statistic. For the 12 months ending in March 2026, total bankruptcy filings rose to 591,850. That's an 11.9% increase from the prior year. Bankruptcy is a lagging indicator. By the time a family officially files, it signals that they've already exhausted every possible temporary sacrifice, every single payment plan, and every ounce of borrowing capacity they had left.
Section 4. The Wealth Gap Reality. How the debt crisis hits low-wealth households the hardest.
Because, let's be totally clear, this crisis does not affect everyone equally. Consider the exact same financial shock hitting two different households. On the left, a household with wealth uses savings, maybe asks family for a bit of help, and just moves on. On the right, a household without wealth faces the exact same emergency, but they don't have that cushion. They're forced to borrow at high interest, and bankruptcy eventually becomes their only way out. It is the same emergency, but an entirely different economic reality.
And all of this is happening right against the backdrop of a collapsing public safety net. When affordable housing, healthcare access, and food assistance are weakened or just outright removed, the human need for those things doesn't magically vanish. Instead, the 99% are forced to replace missing public support with private, punishing debt. Credit cards essentially become the new housing policy. Payday loans become the new food assistance.
So, the core systemic issue we're seeing across all of this data is absolutely clear. The 99% are essentially being forced to finance their own daily survival. Debt is no longer just a consequence of spending too much on luxury items, it is the strictly required backup plan for a broken economy where wages chronically fail to meet the unavoidable costs of living.
Which leaves us with this final, vital question, drawn directly from our source material. Who is this economy growing for? When working families are forced to leverage their own futures just to survive today, we have to take a hard look at the systems that are actively profiting from the interest, the late fees, and the collections. Take a moment to really think about that and what it means for the future of our economic independence. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.